Kathryn Firth directed the MSc in Cities at the LSE, led urban design at KPF and then PLP, and was Chief of Design at the London Legacy Development Corporation. She spent 3 years in Boston, where she was Urban Design Director at NBBJ, as well as teaching at Harvard. She returned to London at the end of last year, and now she's a Mayor's Design Advocate, a partner at FP Design, teaches at the Bartlett, and is chair of the Ealing Design Review Panel. So, Kathryn, the Olympic legacy, of course, you worked on the Olympics, so the legacy, it's a long-term 20-year project. Looking at it now, how do you think it's shaping up?
Well, Peter, we actually went for a walk there. It was the first time, I confess, since being back in London. We went for a walk there a few weeks ago. It was a crisp, sunny day. Now, of course, it's always interesting to judge a place, a new district, if you like, when there's a pandemic. But that notwithstanding, it was just heaving with people. It was really actually quite heartening. There were people there of all ages. It felt like it was acting like a local park. So even though, we don't have tourists in London right now, it was really buzzing. And the parkland's fantastic. I mean, I remember when I was teaching at the LSE, I would take students to that site, and we often used it as a studio site. And you'd have cars upturned in the river and, old tires, and it's transformed, and it's, it really is, I think, acting as an eco corridor as well. And it was interesting because we actually started the walk down at Poplar, and so we see that it's part of the green grid now, which is nice. I mean, you can even cross Stratford High Street in a little more palatable manner than you used to be able to. And what was also interesting was in visiting the area of Chobham Manor, which of course was the first neighborhood to get built out, notwithstanding the Athletes Village, or East Village as it now is known, it actually starts to feel a bit lived in now, which is great. Like, I was sort of happy to see that the road markings were faded. So, some of that pristine newness has gone, which I think is important because there's always this issue of when you create something new, even though we were sort of testing what was new then, the London vernacular, that it doesn't feel like it's a part of London. And I think, in fact, it's looking like a pretty good example of the London vernacular across different typologies, incorporating things, 21st century needs, cycle parking, different types of outdoor space, private outdoor space, and then there's big take up of the multi-generation home. So all of these things, I think, we now see as more important than ever. I'm a little concerned, just looking at the continuation of the new neighborhoods, whether some of the great detailing that we saw at Chobham starts to get distilled out, and I think, careful attention needs to be paid to that. It was also great to see the canal along the Lee navigation. Again, it was just, heaving with people, even hard to keep the 2-meter distance in some cases. The commercial that's fronting, that's in the old press center at Here East, again, seems very busy. And then just thinking about Hackney Wick, where my very savvy colleagues created a conservation area, much to the chagrin of some of the developers, but that does mean that there's been some retention of workspace. Now, I can't speak to how affordable it or the housing is. I mean, I think that may be an issue, but at least there is the right space that's being retained. And then I guess the other thing that seems to be working is this idea of putting community infrastructure around the edges. So you're kind of creating a catchment that's both the new and old residents. So, the schools and some of the new meanwhile uses. And then, just looking to the south a bit to Stratford, I guess what's called now East Bank, Stratford waterfront, where, the V&A and Sadler's are happening, and it's a bit behind schedule, but not too much. But, I've always been delighted when the moment came that introduction of cultural and educational facilities would act as a foil to the big shopping center. So I was pretty impressed with how things are working. A little bit concerned about what's happening maybe at the international quarter, because I think there's the danger in that link between the shopping center and the park of Westfield Avenue feeling a bit like a kind of service street. So we'll see how that plays out. I know there's some good design codes in place now.
Well, it's probably a sort of model piece of post-COVID city. I mean, plenty of healthy green space, places for exercise, all the amenities in easy walking distance, including a museum or two. So a sort of 15-minute city.
Yes, it is in many ways. You're right. Like, certainly in terms of, as you say, movement and fitness. And we saw that when we were there. People were on every kind of active mode. It's great. The TFL cycle scheme is brought into the park. There were people on blades with ski poles, and there are little fitness stations set up. So it is great in terms of that side of sort of health and well-being. And again, we have the community infrastructure. You can walk to the primary schools or to the local surgery. And then, the fact that whatever it was, some 33 bridges and improved underpasses went in. So it's very well connected. As you say, you'll be able to walk to museums and, galleries and go to the theater. I think the challenge right now is, how local do those become? Because certainly in the immediate term, these are not going to be attracting necessarily people from, West London, let alone tourists. So I know from my involvement with the Sadler's Foundation that, they've always talked about a hip hop academy. So, but I think, there's going to have to be a bit of a strong outreach and sort of marrying up with what's happening in terms of the local cultural scene. And that's probably a good thing in the long run, to see these as slightly more local amenities. And then you'll also, you have learning happening with UCL, both up at Here East and then in the south part of the park. So again, the brief for that was that it's very much more open door and permeable than, if you think of, the UCL in Bloomsbury, which is very much of the, the kind of more enclosed and yard tradition. And then I think the other thing that's interesting is with Here East, where it's a pretty good example of adaptable workspace. Like, it's quite flexible. It's great to see the Hawkins Brown sort of cabinet of curiosities actually looks just like it did on the tin. And so that's pretty cool. The thing where I think it falls short is in the retail that, and I think you've probably heard me say this before, that because of Westfield, because we have a large shopping center, in a sense, that's kind of sapped some of the possibility of having more local retail. So it was a little, okay, we have a pandemic right now, but in some ways, what we're seeing everywhere else is the local shops are really thriving. And yet in Chobham, a lot of the, where you're supposed to have shops, they're boarded up still. And I think part of this, and maybe, one needs to look at mechanisms to support those local businesses, but, part of it is they don't want to compete with the, 177,000 square meter Westfield. Having said that, we all know when you go into a Westfield, finding, a hardware store or a place to get your shoes repaired is a little bit challenging. But, I think it was always on Early Avenue, so the route that goes between Hackney Wick and Leighton, that had all the potential for footfall and for being a high street, albeit a lopsided one because of the Athletes Village not providing shop fronts. But although again, it looks kind of well lived in now, it's not as thriving as a place where you think people should be able to get local services as one might hope. So I think, plenty of places to get artisanal coffee and snacks, but maybe sort of more of the convenience store amenities, I think are not always within the 15-minute walk. Chris, my ultimate dream was that the big 5,000 space car park that's attached to Westfield, that's never been at capacity, either pre-pandemic or now, actually just gets redeveloped and provides more critical mass as housing and perhaps workspace. But we'll see if anyone has the appetite for that.
Kathryn, what's your best guess on the shape of London over the next decade or so in a post-COVID environment? And what do you suggest the mayor does to respond to the pandemic to shape London for the next 20 years?
Well, I'd like to be optimistic and think that we won't have collective amnesia after all of this, and that we'll have a London that continues to promote, what in the US gets called road diets, And we have a generous public realm with more parks and plazas. We prioritize equity and find creative ways to attract the best and the brightest, which I think, let's not pretend otherwise. While historically London's always been very resilient, there, between Brexit and the pandemic, we have a challenge on our hands, and I'm worried that there might be a bit of a brain drain, and the kind of great kind of multicultural mix that makes London so amazing, and certainly was what drew me here in the first place, that's at risk. And we know that the population is decreasing. Londoners are going to the second and third tier cities, which is great for those, and that's a long time coming, and that's fabulous, but it will have impacts on both the commercial and cultural activity. But then I was thinking, well, maybe there's a silver lining. Everyone's been talking about how the local is really thriving, and London has always been this collection of villages. And maybe that is our kind of unique selling point, that people will more and more see that you can be in a village and in a big city all at once, and that becomes this great attraction. So, I guess in terms of, the mayor's remit, I see sort of 3 areas of focus. So around use and intensification, and then sort of movement and circulation, and then of course that bugbear affordability. And I think that, as we see London's villages evolve, and we see that we're, kind of working and living in a different way, we need to have a deeper understanding of what that evolution will be, because nothing is ever static. And I mean, one of the very basic things is, I think we need to figure out how to, this is more about a tool for, an urban designer, how to really measure the metrics, how to create metrics that really measure, who is in a place at any one time. So right now, actually measuring dwelling units per hectare is probably more precise than ever, because we're not just sleeping in our homes, we're there all the time. But I think, we have ways to measure where people are, sleeping. We have ways to measure where they're working, but I think we need to understand more about, what's it going to take to keep supporting the local activities. And I guess, that then veers into this issue of high streets. And, yes, they were already dying before the pandemic. I think we need to be more stringent about limiting the multinationals on any high street, and we can do that through design codes, and we can do that through mandates, thinking about precedents like the De Walden estate, where you can, have in Marylebone a charity shop next to Waitrose. I mean, we need to be, it's that mix that makes a place great. And that's, of course, then connected to local identity. And in some cases, it's interesting because that might be taking care of itself, because we don't have as much commercial activity and, studios, exhibition space, maybe some kind of theaters are starting to, take root. And we've seen, the many great precedents in the GLA report for that. But I think for that to really work, we probably need to think about how do we reduce business rates. I mean, I think, it's an incredible financial burden for, for independents to be on high streets. And I think we need to weigh our priorities to that end. And then I think connected to this is who's living on the street. And I think, and this is something I think, you got involved in when we were all part of the Mayor's Design Advisory Group, thinking about aging London. I think, what better place for, older people to be living than in the hub of activity, and to have that kind of intergenerational activity and homes on the high street, I think makes a lot of sense. But then I think one of our biggest challenges, and I think, where the mayor needs to put some focus, is in the City of London. This is not an easy one to transform into one of London's villages. And so, what is it? How do we repurpose? We know it's not an easy task to take, the types of office towers, that have been built in the last 10 years and say, oh, it can all be housing, despite what some are saying, not that easy. So I think, that needs some serious innovation. And then finally, the attention on outer London and the suburbs, where there's momentum gaining for intensification, which is fabulous. Careful or sensitive and surgical intensification, yes. but I think it needs to go beyond just ancillary units at the end of people's gardens. And I'm glad to see there's growing attention. And this was something that I got involved in looking at when I was in the States, at, looking at places like business parks. They're trying to, create these wonderful lifestyle environments, but living is not part of that. And as I say, I see that, more and more people are starting to look at that, but that needs to be something that, where it's a kind of easier path to realize that. And at the same time, maybe thinking back to, Peter Hall, where, proclaiming the suburbs and the city shouldn't be the same. And maybe this is a moment to see what, different ways of bringing nature and other reasons people move to the suburbs into those environments, which tend to right now be a sort of series of, inexpensive sheds and asphalt. And then just quickly on movement and active travel, fabulous to see how more and more people are cycling. It's not just us diehards, but I think there's still a need to join the dots. I can still cycle from West London into the center of London and experience 7 different types of bike lanes, even though I'm not on 7 different types of street. So I think if we want to make people comfortable cycling, it needs to be, it's like any kind of wayfinding, it needs to be unified. And I'm hoping that that shopkeepers have sort of calmed down about, with this sort of focus on the local, with not having to have so many, have cars and parking out front, etc. And so, maybe people won't all be getting back in their cars, or well, they are getting in their cars because they want to go to the tube, but that there'll be more of an appetite, on streets where it's a bit contentious to bring cycle lanes in. And then the other area, which again, I think is getting more and more traction, is this idea of the logistics hubs. And that, can we start to identify places, in town where there are these hubs that are serving many purposes. It's not just about bringing goods in, but they're a place that people walk to. So it's like, whether you love or hate Amazon, there's some good precedents where, right in the center of activity is a place that you go and pick up your package. It doesn't need to come to you. Yes, in some cases, some people will still need it to come to the door, but hey, that should be part of our 10,000 steps to go and pick up, your online purchase. And then finally, this goes back to the sort of considering all generations. And I think one of the things that had been suggested in the days of MDAG was this idea of a kind of the Freedom Pass doing a bit more work. So it would also tell people, where there are facilities, where there are walk times. And we have the technology for this. And so it'd be great to push that. And then I guess finally is that issue around affordability. I think there needs to be even more focus on key worker housing. Again, we've seen during the pandemic, that not only are healthcare workers, at risk in hospitals, but they're at risk getting to the hospitals. And so we need to have, more of that kind of co-location facilitated. And that's, again, it's an opportunity for intensification, but, it's going to need some support. And I guess, perhaps not a very popular thought, but I think restricting absentee kind of foreign ownership, maybe the 2% stamp duty, I think that's coming in April, that surcharge will help, but maybe we have to go even further and, it's stamp duty at point of sale as well. I don't have the answer for that one, but I think it's, it's always it's sort of very disquieting when you think of the number of sort of empty accommodation across the city.
So tell me, what sort of projects are you working on at the moment?
I'm on an advisory panel reporting to Nottingham City Council, where this has been a long time coming. They're looking to redevelop Broadmarsh Centre and the sort of 20 acres associated with that. So a major opportunity. So, helping them devise a brief for that. I'm also involved in a master plan in Lewis, where one of the key drivers is 15-minute city, the idea about shared living, thinking about sort of activities geared to younger people, maker space, and because it's on the river, the issue of sort of coastal resiliency is pretty key on that one. And then I'm involved in a couple of research projects, a project that I began actually with NBBJ because they have such a big focus on healthcare, which is looking at that link between healthcare, and urban design, but sort of beyond just, oh, we should have lots of cycle stations, thinking more about, you know, the sort of institutional links. And then also I'm on one of the 5 finalist teams for that very exciting Thamesmead project. So we'll see how that plays out.
Well, thank you very much, Kathryn, for lots of splendid ideas for the mayor to take on board as he looks at post-COVID London. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you very much, Peter. Take care.